Mark bought the house he always wanted: 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a 2-car garage, and a backyard big enough to justify a riding mower. He locked in a $680,000 mortgage at 7.1%, shook hands with his realtor, and felt, for about 2 weeks, like he'd finally made it. Sarah bought a house nobody would post on Instagram: 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, in a quiet neighborhood where people cut their own grass. She paid $340,000, and then she bought something else. 10 years later, Mark has a beautiful home and roughly $190,000 in equity. Sarah has a beautiful home, $95,000 in equity on it, and a rental property that netted her $1,100 a month for the last 8 years. That's over $105,000 in collected rent, plus appreciation on 2 assets, plus a tenant who's been paying down the mortgage on property number 2 since the day she closed. The gap in their net worth isn't a little awkward, it's life-altering. Here's the thing: most people refuse to admit the house you live in is not an investment. It feels like one, it looks like one on paper, but the moment you move in, it stops producing anything. It only consumes your mortgage, your taxes, your insurance, your time, your weekends, your Sunday afternoons at Home Depot, buying things you don't need to fix things that weren't broken. Your primary residence is a lifestyle decision dressed up in the language of wealth. And that framing, "I'm building equity," is the most expensive story the American middle class tells itself. Because here's what equity in your primary home actually is: it's money you can't touch without either selling the place you live or borrowing against it at interest. It's capital in a box with a lock on it. Meanwhile, that same capital deployed somewhere else could be working for you every single month. Equity sitting in a home you live in is the financial equivalent of hiring someone and then never giving them any work. If this kind of perspective on what actually builds wealth makes sense to you, subscribe to the channel. I post weekly videos breaking down the financial traps the middle class has been taught to accept as truth. But wait, isn't owning your home smarter than renting? Shouldn't you build equity where you live? This is where the conventional wisdom gets people in trouble. Not because it's entirely wrong, but because it's dangerously incomplete. The question was never rent versus own. The question is, what are you doing with the money you would have spent on a larger, more expensive home? Most people never ask that. They get pre-approved for the maximum the bank will give them, pick the nicest house they can justify, and spend the next 30 years paying it off, proud of themselves for doing the responsible thing. The bank, by the way, is thrilled. Let's run the actual numbers on Mark's situation. His $680,000 mortgage at 7.1% over 30 years, his total interest paid before a single repair, before property taxes, before insurance, is roughly $970,000. He will pay almost $1 million for the privilege of owning a home worth $680,000. And in the meantime, the capital he tied up in a 20% down payment, $136,000, is frozen inside an asset that produces zero income. But here's the part the bank absolutely does not want you to calculate. That same $136,000 used as a down payment on a rental property instead could generate cash flow from day one, not fantasy cash flow, real boring monthly cash flow. And as that property appreciates, as the tenant pays down the loan, as rents inch upward over time, that initial investment compounds in ways that a nicer master bathroom simply cannot. This is not about becoming a landlord with 40 units and a property management empire. This is not about being on HGTV. This is about one house, the right house, not the house you live in. Sarah understood something Mark didn't. Your primary residence should be the floor, not the ceiling. Buy something solid, something functional, something in a neighborhood with staying power, and then stop there. Because every dollar you spend upgrading your living situation is a dollar that isn't out there working for you somewhere else. Most people have this completely backwards. They stretch to buy the best home they can afford, then spend years trying to recover financially before they can even think about investing. They confuse lifestyle inflation with wealth building, and the decade they lose, their 30s or their early 40s, those are the compounding years. You don't get those back. Right now, I want you to stop and think about this. If you already own a home, do you know exactly how much equity you have sitting in it? And more importantly, do you know what that equity is doing for you today? If the answer is nothing, you're not alone, but you might be leaving more on the table than you think. Drop a comment below and tell me, does your home feel like an asset or a trap? Because a lot of people feel that tension and don't have a name for it yet. The move Sarah made wasn't complicated. It didn't require a real estate license or a rich uncle or a market that cooperated perfectly. It required one decision made with clarity instead of emotion. And that decision had a 10-year tail on it. That changed her entire financial life. Let me show you exactly how she did it. Sarah didn't buy a rental property because she had extra money lying around. She bought it instead of the upgrade. When she and her husband were pre-approved for $620,000, they sat down and made a deliberate choice: buy less house than they could afford and use the difference both in down payment and in monthly cash flow to acquire something that would actually produce income. They bought their primary home for $340,000. Then, 8 months later, after building a little more savings, they closed on a 3-bedroom rental property in a nearby suburb for $265,000. 20% down, $53,000. Monthly mortgage on the rental, $1,420. At the rate they locked. Market rent in that area, $2,100. That's $680 a month in gross cash flow before expenses. After insurance, taxes, and a small maintenance reserve, call it $400 to $450 a month net. Not life-changing on day one. But that's not the point. The point is that someone else is paying off her mortgage. 10 years in, here's what Sarah's balance sheet looks like. Her rental property, bought at $265,000, has appreciated at a modest 3.5% annually. It's now worth roughly $374,000. Her loan balance has dropped to about $198,000 from 10 years of payments, most of which her tenant made. Her equity position, $176,000 in an asset she's barely touched. Plus, she collected north of $105,000 in cumulative rent over that decade, even accounting for one bad year with a vacancy. Mark, in that same window, has been funneling every extra dollar into a $680,000 home. His equity looks bigger in raw numbers, but his net worth, when you factor in total interest paid, the opportunity cost of that $136,000 down payment, and the absence of any passive income stream, trails Sarah's by a margin that would genuinely shock him if he ever ran the math. He won't run the math. Most people don't. It's easier to look at a rising Zillow estimate and feel wealthy. Now here's the second move, and this is where it accelerates. Around year 8 or 9, Sarah did something that looked counterintuitive from the outside. She refinanced her rental property and pulled out $80,000 in equity, not to spend it, to deploy it. She put $60,000 into a diversified dividend portfolio and kept $20,000 in reserve. That portfolio, at a conservative 5% yield, generates $3,000 a year in passive income, $250 a month that requires nothing from her. Now she has 2 streams running simultaneously: rent, dividends, both funded ultimately by one smart purchase made in her early 30s. People hear this and immediately say, but what about the risk? What if the tenant stops paying? What if rates spike? What if the neighborhood turns? These are real concerns. Nobody's pretending real estate is frictionless, but here's the thing. The risk of doing nothing is also real. It's just slower and quieter, so people mistake it for safety. The risk of spending your peak earning years buying more house than you need, watching equity accumulate in an asset that can't pay a single bill, arriving at 60 with a paid off home and a retirement account that can't quite carry you. That risk doesn't announce itself, it just arrives. One well chosen rental property, managed conservatively with a long time horizon, is not a gamble. It's a machine. It's slow, it's unglamorous, and it works. In about 60 seconds, I'll show you the one mistake even smart investors make when they buy that first rental, and it costs them years. The mistake is this: they buy for cash flow and ignore everything else. They find a property that pencils at $400 a month net and stop there. But cash flow at purchase is just one variable. What matters more over a 10 or 20-year hold is the total return, appreciation, loan paydown, tax advantages, and the optionality that comes with a strong asset. A property in a declining area that cash flows beautifully today might be worth $40,000 less in a decade. Meanwhile, a property in a growing suburb that barely breaks even at purchase could be your single best investment by year 15. Buy in places where people want to live, where employers are growing, where supply is constrained by geography or regulation. You want renters who can pay and choose to stay. Turnover is the silent killer of rental economics. One tenant who stays 5 years is worth 3 tenants who stay 18 months each in saved vacancy, saved repairs, saved stress. And keep the property simple. Not a fixer-upper that becomes a renovation rabbit hole. Not a luxury unit with high carrying costs and picky tenants. A clean, functional, well-maintained property in a neighborhood that working professionals want to call home. That's it. That's the target. Sarah's rental is a beige 3-bedroom with a finished basement and an attached garage. Nobody would film a YouTube tour of it. It's been rented continuously for 9 years by 2 different families who treated it like their own. She gets a call maybe twice a year about something meaningful. It is, by every metric, boring. It is also the asset that is quietly funding her optionality. She and her husband are now in their early 40s. Their rental income, their dividends, and their own modest savings rate have them on track to make work optional before 50. Not retired in a hammock somewhere, optional, which means every hour they work from here forward is a choice, not a sentence. Mark just replaced his HVAC system, $14,000. He put it on a home equity line. The difference between Mark and Sarah isn't income. It isn't luck. It isn't financial genius. It's one decision. She bought the house that pays her, not just the house that impresses people. You only need one. If this hit close to home, no pun intended, watch my video on why buying a $500,000 house might be the single most expensive mistake you ever make. The numbers there will finish what we started here.